Early on in the pandemic, we had a conversation kind of nationally as to what constitutes something that is essential. Even on the show, I had conversations with people on our guest show about whether or not church should be considered essential. Regardless of what you think about the matter, it is undeniable that we allowed liquor stores to be essential, but we told churches that they need to shut down. And the repercussions of this have weaved their way into society, especially among young teenagers, where we see 1 in 3 young girls in America have suicidal thoughts. Now, that is an exponential increase above what we were experiencing before the pandemic. Now, by the way, social media has exponentially increased the suicide rate, especially among young girls, but it was furthered and catalyzed by what we did during the pandemic, simply because we said things like church, where people can commune with others, where they can worship, where they can hopefully find some of the answers to their soul's ache. We shut those down and said those are non-essential. Now, in the process of not only declaring that church was not essential, those few brave pastors who were willing to push against the idea that a church could be considered not essential, and that the government could dictate to society more broadly what exactly is essential and what is not essential, and that people would follow along with it. There were some brave pastors who withstood that idea. Now, that didn't stop the government from trying to do their darndest to make sure that people obeyed them. And what only can be considered as soft totalitarianism, if not totalitarianism proper, we saw at least one church being surveilled and being targeted by a local government, and this in San Jose, California. I'm going to read an article for you from the Free Press. A church, the state, and a holy war. Calvary Chapel in Silicon Valley refused to close during COVID lockdowns, arguing freedom of religion. Then the government surveillance began. Now, I want to take just a moment to read this article to you, not only to showcase the bravery of this pastor, but also to show you how the government, when inundated by secular humanism, can find themselves surveilling churches and doing so without it actually weighing upon their conscience at all. So the article goes on to say this. It was Father's Day 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and Marcy Dower was walking with her husband Monty along the beach in Santa Cruz when they noticed a young woman sitting alone by the pier, disoriented and crying. She said she had lost her phone and her friends, says Marcy. It was 1 p.m. and I could smell alcohol on her breath. I asked her how she'd get home, and she said, "I don't know." The girl was 18 years old. Marcy, who has been a practicing Christian for 40 years, asked the young woman if she could pray with her, and she said yes. Afterward, the woman confided in the Dowers that she had been raped. Marcy offered the woman a ride to the hospital or police station, but she refused. She said she wanted to go to church. Now, amazing story to start with there, but let's see the complications with doing just that during the pandemic. As far as Marcy knew, no churches were open in Santa Cruz at the time due to the COVID-19 lockdown ordered by Santa Cruz County's Public Health Department. The couple's own church in nearby Santa Clara County had been closed for months because of similar restrictions. But Marcy kept in touch with the woman, and a week later she heard from a friend that Calvary Chapel in nearby San Jose was open. So the next Sunday, we took her. When Marcy, her family, and the young woman walked through the church on June 28, 2020, just weeks after Dr. Anthony Fauci declared COVID-19 his worst nightmare, came to life, she saw some 300 people singing gospel hymns played by musicians on the violin and guitar. A slender, gray-bearded man gave them a nod from behind the pulpit. He was unmasked, and so was almost everyone in the church, including Marcy. At lunch afterward, the young woman expressed how much the service meant to her. At that time, nothing was normal, and she needed normalcy. Marcy said of her companion, it was healing for her. Now, I think this is super, super interesting, just to stop real quick, because this is an isolated anecdotal story, obviously, but how many people actually were suffering from the very same thing, but found no place of hope, no place of restoration, except for potentially outlets just to issue forth drugs and prescription medications to an individual who's suffering with some form of depression, rather than this kind of holistic and more important, healthy way of dealing with the issues that are going on in your life. And so ultimately, thank God for this one anecdotal story and this one young girl who was able to find hope because a church refused to shut down in the midst of Fauci's fear-mongering. The article goes on and it says this. At first, Calvary abided by the lockdown rules, but 2 months later on Sunday, May 24th, Pastor Mike McClure, known to his flock as Pastor Mike, gave a sermon outside his church. God doesn't want us to isolate, he declared. All of us need to be in the sanctuary. I don't care what they say. I'm never again going to close our doors, ever. Church services were held the following Sunday and every Sunday after in open defiance of the law. Now, what a man. We need more pastors like him. The article goes on. In August of 2020, as part of a civil enforcement program, the county created a business compliance unit of 10 employees tasked with investigating any violations of COVID-19 regulations. Right there, we have the bureaucratic state on steroids. This civil enforcement program is absolutely a violation of civil rights to every single person in that city. And of course, that's what they went on to do. The article says, it also effectively encouraged citizens to act as spies to report on their neighbors using a special website and a hotline, promising that those who filed complaints could do so confidentially. Thank God for the SS going around telling everybody how to rat on their neighbors. Doesn't sound like Nazi Germany at all. After an anonymous complaint was directed at Calvary on August 21st, 2020, the church was slapped with a cease and desist order for holding indoor gatherings. 2 days later, officers from the compliance unit turned up at the church's doors and reported at least 100 masked people inside, not distancing and singing. Oh, the humanity of it all. From then on, officials observed the church reported on violations and hit it with fines. Each day a violation was not corrected, the county doubled the fine for the violation up to a maximum of $5,000 per day. To date, the fines have piled up to a staggering $2.8 million. Now, I won't read the rest of the article. I'll link it down below for you, but just suffice to say, as the church consistently refused to obey what the city was telling them to do, they not only piled up fines, but they also sent surveillance agents with this civil enforcement program to surveil this church and to consistently surveil them so that they could rack up this huge $2.8 million fine. So in one part of the article, it says that a local church that is across the street allowed government officials to come in and spy on the church from across the street through a gate that was around the church. So obviously the pastor of that church is an insufferable coward and gutless and spineless and heartless and brainless, and probably other less things too that won't go mention. But suffice to say, the government, in concert with a group of citizens, ratting on a church so that it has crushing fines piled up on it just simply because they want to provide the kind of healing salve that can come to young girls like the one mentioned at the beginning of this story is absolutely ridiculous. Ridiculous that they would think that they could get away with this too. Now, the church is fighting back in court and the city is fighting back against the church and trying to countersue them. We'll see how this all shakes out, but hopefully this slipping of the mask yet again by those in our government and those in positions of power, hopefully it helps us realize something, that the secular humanists in society, those who were responsible in the past for great atrocities, I would argue, Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, and Maoist China, these secular humanist regimes, as long as you do what they say, they're perfectly happy to be your friend. But the moment you step outside of their prescribed rules, well, then you become the subject of surveillance, the subject of scrutiny, and the subject of crushing fines in order to try to put you out of business. What is this except for soft totalitarianism? So obviously, Nazi Germany is an overwrought symbol used by simple people who really don't even know anything about what took place in World War II. But here it seems pretty accurate. It seems pretty accurate that not only are they trying to crush this church, but they are doing so because they disobeyed their rules. Now, these arbitrary rules defined by this county in San Jose are the least of our concerns. The bigger and more broad concern is that secular humanism is a principle that that kind of justifies this ideology, this mentality. It justifies it in this way. When God is not on the throne, somebody must take his place. Now, I've made this argument before, but so forgive me if you've heard it, and you can comment down below if you love the argument. If not, thanks for watching. But Nietzsche argued that there was blood on the hands of the people who had killed God, but now that we have killed God, there was no one to wipe the blood away. And he asked this question: who shall clean the blood from our hands? Shall we not have to come up with our own festivals and our own ceremonies in order to justify the death of this being? In other words, Nietzsche was honest enough to understand that the repercussions for the death of God meant that there was a vacuum in society that would have to be filled. And ultimately, my argument is just this: when secular humanists are on the throne and God is not, that this kind of stuff actually is not only plausible, as we see in this story, but also rationally acceptable to the secular humanist, because the people with the most amount of power can push it down on those who have less power, because the secular humanist has no greater power, no greater authority telling them and dictating to them how they should go about the truth. So nonetheless, we find ourselves in the present desperate to search for truth and to understand truth, while the government suppresses it from the public. So you just got done watching a small excerpt of a much larger episode. You can find the link to that full episode down below in the description of this video. So you definitely want to check that out, because if you like that clip, you'll like the much larger episode. And while you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and click that little bell to be notified when great new episodes of Indie Thinker come your way. Thanks for watching.